Sometime in the late evening, if you were to stand at the edge of the Venetian lagoon, looking south across the still water, you might notice a small shape on the horizon, a low, dark island, trees bent slightly by the salt wind, a crumbling bell tower just visible above the tree line. Boats do not stop there. Fishermen steer around it without being asked, and if you were to point toward it and ask a local what it is, they might pause for just a moment before answering. "That is Poveglia," they would say, and then they would look away. Tonight, we are going to visit that island, not in the dark and not in fear, but gently, the way historians do, with curiosity and care. Because beneath the stories and the silence, Poveglia carries one of the most extraordinary and deeply human histories in all of Europe, a place shaped not by war or conquest, but by plague and mercy, and the long, quiet work of keeping the living safe from the dying. Settle in now. The water is calm tonight, and the story begins a very long time ago. Poveglia sits in the southern portion of the Venetian lagoon, roughly halfway between the city of Venice and the island of Lido. It is small. You could walk its entire length in 10 minutes. In another age, in a gentler age, it might have been a peaceful place, surrounded by water, touched by sea breezes, catching the amber light of afternoon in ways that make the Adriatic shimmer like hammered bronze. Its earliest recorded history is quiet enough. People settled there sometime around the 5th or 6th century, when mainland populations were fleeing the chaos of the late Roman world. The Visigoths were moving through the peninsula. Cities were uncertain places. And so families gathered what they could carry and made their way to the small islands of the lagoon, where the water offered a natural kind of protection. Poveglia was among these refuge islands. For several centuries, it supported a modest community. People fished, prayed, raised children, buried their dead in the sandy soil. But the island's character began to shift, slowly and then decisively, in the 14th century. The year 1347 is one that history has not forgotten. It was the year the Black Death arrived in Europe, carried on trading ships from the Black Sea coast, making landfall in Sicily, and then spreading northward with a speed that stunned even those who had heard the rumors. Venice, one of the great trading cities of the medieval world, was particularly vulnerable. Ships came and went constantly from the eastern Mediterranean, from North Africa, from ports where the plague had already been burning for months. The city's merchants understood trade. They understood profit. They were now forced to understand something else entirely: contagion. The Venetian response to the plague was, in certain ways, remarkable. Not because it was effective. The medicine of the 14th century had no answer for Yersinia pestis, but because it was organized. In 1374, Venice established what may have been the world's first public health magistrate, a committee of officials charged specifically with managing the spread of disease. Their tool was isolation. Their method would eventually give the world a word that still carries weight today: quarantine, from the Italian quarantina, meaning 40 days, the period a ship and its crew were required to wait before anyone could come ashore. But the ships had to wait somewhere, and the sick, as they grew more numerous, had to be housed somewhere, and the dead had to be buried somewhere. That somewhere, increasingly, was Poveglia.
The island's role as a place of isolation began formally in 1403, when Venetian authorities designated it as a quarantine station. Ships arriving from suspicious ports were directed there. Passengers showing signs of illness were offloaded there. The healthy waited beside the unwell, and many who arrived on Poveglia did not leave it again. It is difficult, from this distance, to fully imagine what life on the island must have been like during those years. The lagoon, beautiful in calm weather, could be cold and harsh in winter. The wooden structures built to house the quarantined were rough. The food was adequate at best. And the fear, the silent, constant fear, must have been extraordinary. You had been taken from your ship, perhaps separated from family members, brought to a low island surrounded by gray water and told to wait, sometimes for 40 days, sometimes forever. There were caretakers, priests who administered last rites because the dying needed them constantly, workers who managed the burials, who carried out the grim logistics of mortality on an industrial scale. They were brave, these people, or perhaps they simply had no other choice. The plague returned to Europe not once but in waves, across the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. Each time it swept through Venice, Poveglia absorbed part of the burden. The island received the sick, housed the dying, buried the dead. Estimates of the human remains beneath Poveglia's soil are difficult to verify precisely. The number 100,000 has been repeated often enough to take on a kind of mythological weight. The true figure may be different, but this much is certain. The ground of Poveglia is saturated with history, with loss, with the accumulated weight of countless individual lives ended far from home. The soil there is dark and rich in ways that the Venetians noticed. For many years the island's earth was harvested and used to produce a distinctive kind of mortar. The builders of Venice, in a quiet and unintended way, incorporated Poveglia into the city's very walls.
By the 18th century, the nature of the island's isolation work had evolved. The quarantine station was formalized further, with a proper Lazaretto, a medical facility, established to manage incoming patients. The word Lazaretto itself comes from a corruption of the name Nazareth, and from the biblical Lazarus, patron of lepers. These facilities were the hospitals of an era that did not yet have hospitals in the modern sense, places where the sick were moved from society, cared for as well as the available knowledge allowed, and either recovered or did not. The Poveglia Lazaretto functioned for decades. It was part of a system. Venice had other quarantine islands in its lagoon. The Lazaretto Vecchio to the north is the oldest known quarantine facility in the world, dating to 1423. Poveglia fit into this network as one node among several, each island holding a particular piece of the city's strategy for keeping plague outside its famous canals. And then, in 1793, something occurred that would shift the island's story again. 2 ships entering the Venetian lagoon were found to carry passengers showing signs of illness. They were directed immediately to Poveglia. The old machinery of quarantine ground back into motion. The sick were taken ashore. Some recovered, many did not. It was one of the last major deployments of the island for epidemic quarantine. Napoleon was remaking the map of Europe. By 1797, the Venetian Republic, that extraordinary 1,000-year experiment in mercantile democracy, fell to French forces. The lagoon's quarantine system was reorganized, simplified, eventually superseded by newer methods. Poveglia was quiet for a while. It rested.
Then, in 1922, it became something else again. A mental asylum was established on the island. The existing buildings were repurposed, new structures were added, and for several decades, Poveglia served as a psychiatric institution, housing patients who, by the standards of the era, had been deemed unable to live within ordinary society. The history of psychiatric care in the early 20th century is a complicated and often painful one. The field was young, its methods frequently misguided, and the conditions in many institutions across Europe left much to be desired by any modern standard. What precisely happened on Poveglia during those years is difficult to verify in detail. Records are incomplete, accounts are fragmentary. What has grown up in their place, inevitably, are stories. The particular kind of story that haunted places attract to themselves, stories of suffering and cruelty and strange happenings in the night. Some of these stories are almost certainly embellished. Others may contain seeds of truth that cannot now be separated from the embellishments around them. The asylum closed in 1968. The last patients were transferred to facilities on the mainland. The last staff departed. The buildings were left to themselves, and Poveglia became what it has been ever since: abandoned.
There is something about abandoned islands that the imagination finds irresistible. Perhaps it is the water that does it, the sense of a barrier, of separation, of a place that has been set apart from the ordinary world and left to its own processes. Vines work their way through windows. Trees push up through floors. Salt air softens stone and wooden beams and plaster walls with a patient, democratic thoroughness. Poveglia's buildings have been decaying for more than 50 years now. The hospital wards are open to the sky in places. The bell tower, which once called the faithful to Mass in a church that no longer functions, leans slightly, its stone pitted by decades of weather. The gardens that once surrounded the medical facility have gone wild, brambles and tall grasses reclaiming the spaces where patients once walked in the afternoons. The Italian government, which owns the island, has occasionally considered what to do with it. In 2014, it was briefly listed for a 99-year lease, attracting interest from developers who imagined boutique hotels, wellness retreats, the kind of restorative luxury that Venetian islands are well suited to. The lease was awarded, then contested, then entangled in Italian legal proceedings. As of recent years, Poveglia remains in limbo, belonging to the state, accessible only to authorized visitors, slowly and beautifully falling apart. Local fishermen still avoid the waters immediately around it, as their fathers and grandfathers did. Whether this is superstition, or simply the memory of a long prohibition, or something else entirely is hard to say. Perhaps it does not much matter. Some distances are maintained not because they are enforced, but because they have become, over time, a kind of respect.
What is Poveglia at its heart? It is not, if we are being honest, a place of horror. It is a place of history. And history, when examined closely, is almost always about the same thing. People trying to manage circumstances that were larger than themselves, with the tools they had available, under conditions they did not choose. The magistrates who designated Poveglia as a quarantine station were not cruel. They were doing what public health requires, making difficult decisions to protect the many at a cost to the few. The priests who lived and worked on the island, administering sacraments to the dying, were exercising a profound kind of courage. The workers who buried the dead, season after season, year after year, were doing necessary and honorable work. Even the asylum, troubling as the history of institutional psychiatry tends to be when examined, existed because someone believed that people with mental illness deserved care, however imperfect that care turned out to be. The building of the facility was an act of intention, if not always of wisdom. And beneath all of it, beneath the plague dead and the quarantined passengers and the patients and the priests, beneath the layers of Venetian history, there is the island itself. Patient, salt-scoured, indifferent to human categories of dark and light. It has been here for a long time. It will be here longer still.
There is a particular kind of beauty that abandoned places have in the early morning, before the light has fully settled, when the sky is the pale color of old linen and the water is flat and silver. If you were to see Poveglia then, from a passing vaporetto perhaps, moving through the southern lagoon while most of Venice was still sleeping, it would look almost peaceful. The trees would be still, the broken roof lines would be softened by mist. The bell tower would rise against the sky with the quiet authority of things that have simply endured. There is a saying, not specific to Venice, but true there nonetheless. A city is not its buildings, but its stories. The same could be said of an island. Poveglia's buildings are ruins, but its stories, of human ingenuity in the face of plague, of public health policy born centuries before the germ theory of disease, of ordinary people doing extraordinary work in terrible circumstances, those stories remain. They are here in the dark and rich soil, in the walls that still stand, in the name that local fishermen have carried in their mouths for generations, the name they say with that particular pause, that slight dropping of the eyes. Poveglia, an island no one returns to, and an island tonight that we have visited together, quietly and with care. The water in the lagoon is very still now. The bell tower is dark against the sky. And somewhere beneath the soil and the salt grass and the long grasses of the abandoned garden, 1,000 years of human effort rests in a sleep that is at last undisturbed. Let yourself rest now too. The island keeps its stories well. They will be there in the morning. Good night.